Hi everybody, and welcome to this second in a series of videos about thesis statements. My name is Dr. Ted Remington. I am Associate Professor of English at the University of St. Francis in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And in this video, what we're going to do is look at 5 different kinds of thesis statements that aren't really thesis statements, or at least not very good ones. And this is basically the product of me thinking back over all the student papers I've read over the years and seeing if I could identify some common threads in ways in which thesis statements that students wrote didn't quite hit the mark, and seeing if I could kind of collect these into some common families of typical mistakes that are made in thesis statements. So we'll look at 5 of them that I came up with, and most of the thesis statements that I see that don't really pass muster fall into at least one of these categories. So we'll look at some examples of these as examples of what to avoid when writing a thesis statement. And they fall into these categories: the matter-of-fact thesis, the wishy-washy thesis, the duh thesis, the hazy thesis, and the screaming thesis. First one is the matter-of-fact thesis, and this violates the first rule of good thesis writing, which is that you need to have an opinion in your thesis statement. Matter-of-fact thesis simply states a fact, not an opinion. So here's some examples. There are several different points of view about abortion in America today. Well, yes, there are, but that's not an opinion. Hehuman beings are affected by their environment in many ways. Again, yes, they are. Doesn't say anything about the writer's opinion about this, though. Healthcare costs in this country are rising. Again, that's a simple matter of statistical fact. It's could be right or wrong, but it's a fact one way or the other, a statement of fact. And again, remember that what we want in a thesis is an opinion. So these are simply facts and not opinions, and therefore they're not thesis statements. The next one we'll look at is a wishy-washy thesis. And this is a case where, yes, the author is stating something that is an opinion, but it's stated in such a kind of, cautious way that it doesn't really work as a thesis statement. The wording is very qualified, and it's not really clear that the author is really staking a claim about the topic. So, for example, it might be possible that a new legislation could help improve the conditions in nursing homes. Notice all the qualifiers there. It might be possible that new legislation could help improve the conditions in nursing homes. Yeah, that's an opinion, but it's, again, got so much qualifying language in there that it doesn't seem like the author is really taking a stand. Next one, education could play a fairly important role in success later in life. Well, again, we have could play, fairly important. Again, these are, you can sort of feel the hesitation in the writer who doesn't want to get it wrong, and so that they're adding all these kinds of rhetorical trap doors in their thesis statements for a quick escape in case anybody takes issue with what they're saying. Last one, there are important similarities between Christianity and Islam, but some important differences too. And this is a very typical formulation that sort of takes the general form of, on the one hand this, but on the other hand that. And notice that there's no real claim being made here. There's some similarities, there's some differences. Well, that's fairly obvious. There's no real claim about why they're important or what they even are. So that's the wishy-washy thesis. The duh thesis is a little bit better than the wishy-washy, but not much. You do have an opinion, so it's not simply a statement of fact, and it is stated in a slightly more clear and forceful way. But the problem with the duh thesis is that the opinion is so widely held and is so taken for granted by your readers that there's really almost no point in even stating it. So, for example, Hamlet is one of the most profound and masterful plays ever written. Well, guess what? People have been saying that for roughly 400 years or so. That's not really stating anything that is going to challenge or even pique the interest of your readers. The Holocaust was a tragic episode in European history. Well, of course it was. And technically, that's an opinion because it does use emotional language, a tragic episode. But it's an opinion that is so widely held, so universally held, that it's not really a thesis. Again, a thesis should, in some sense, challenge the reader. You should be able to at least imagine a reasonable person somewhere disagreeing with what you're saying. Last one, the well-being of the patient should be a priority for a healthcare worker. Well, again, that's barely qualifies as an opinion because even though it's stated fairly forcefully, the opinion is so widely held that it's not really saying anything. So that's a duh thesis. The hazy thesis is a close relative of the wishy-washy thesis. And here we have, yes, an opinion. Yes, it's stated fairly directly. And it may even be one that not everyone will automatically agree with. But it's worded in such a way that it's not at all clear what the author is actually stating. So, for example, action must be taken to lower the rate of underage drinking. Well, okay, what action should be taken and why should it be taken? Why is it important for us to do this? Judaism has influenced Christianity in many interesting ways. Okay, but what ways and why are they interesting and why should we care about them? We need to rethink how we train K through 12 instructors to meet the needs of today's students. Well, who is we and what are the needs of today's students and how do we need to rethink the way we train teachers? So, all of these are, there's an opinion lurking in there somewhere, but the wording is so vague that it's not at all clear what the author is actually saying. And all of these first four are cases usually of the author just being a little bit too timid in her or his thinking and being worried that they are going to be, critiqued or criticized or told that they're wrong. And so they end up creating this way of stating something that kind of sounds like a thesis but really isn't. The last example we'll look at is on the other side of the spectrum entirely. There is no doubt that an opinion is being expressed. It's being expressed very forcefully, and it is certainly something that someone might disagree with, and it may even be very vivid in its wording, but that can almost be a problem. And this is the case of thesis statements where the author is simply stating something in extremely exaggerated or overly emotional terminology. So, for example, the death penalty is despicable and must be ended, or the invasion of Iraq was justified and anyone who doubts that is an idiot or a traitor. Lastly, requiring healthcare professionals to know conversational Spanish is the only sensible action in our multicultural country. So these are good in that they're opinions. I could imagine people writing interesting papers about any or all of these topics. The problem is that they violate the idea that a thesis statement and, in fact, a academic essay in general should be part of a conversation. When you're having a conversation with somebody, you don't want to get into their face and yell at them at the top of your lungs. If you actually want to engage with someone, you follow some basic rules of civility and politeness. And basically telling the reader from the get-go that they're an idiot if they don't already think the way you do is not going to engage them. So this is taking the idea of a thesis statement being an opinion, but going so far with it that it's not even really a rational statement of an opinion. It's simply you screaming out your point of view and daring the reader to disagree with you. And that's not really a good thesis either. Let's look at some thesis statements that do work, all right? And these, by the way, are all thesis statements that were written by college undergraduates, written in essays that I've seen published on the web or from my own archives. First one, comedian Chris Rock uses his comedy to challenge and reaffirm social values. Specific, it's an opinion, it's interesting, it's not obvious, so it's a thesis. By drawing from and reiterating pre-existing notions of community and collective identification, Bush associated traditional values of the U.S. democratic ideal with his own agenda. This is from a paper doing a rhetorical critique of presidential rhetoric, and you can see that it's specific, it's interesting, it's not shouting at us, it's a good thesis. from a paper on U.S. history focusing on women in the workplace early in the 20th century. An analysis of the available evidence reveals that rather than being exploited, these women workers shaped their experience for their own purposes, actively engaging in expanding the constricted opportunities for women. Again, it's specific, it's stating an opinion, it's clearly challenging some accepted points of view, and it's just a well thought out, well articulated thesis statement. Last one, computer charting is the best choice for healthcare providers to ensure quality record keeping for their patients. Again, it's specific, it's an opinion, it's not necessarily obvious, but it's not saying computer charting is clearly the best choice, and anyone who thinks it's not is a moron. It's being polite and being, yes, passionate and being very forceful in its statement, but it does it without being over the top. Now, could all of these thesis statements be made even better? Sure, you can certainly tick some of these thesis statements for not being quite as specific as they could be, for not being as forceful, or maybe for being too forceful. But we're talking about small matters of degree. These are all cases of an author stating an opinion. It's specific. It's one that someone could reasonably disagree with. It is not loaded with lots of qualifying terms to sort of get the reader out, or the author out of saying something specific. These are all good thesis statements that I would, as an instructor, love to see in a paper, and just as a reader, would be interested in reading, regardless of whether it was from a student or whether it was appearing in a magazine or journal. And that's the idea of coming up with a good thesis statement.